Waxahachie, Texas, December 1993. The kind of town where church bells rang every Sunday morning and everyone knew their neighbors by name. Where summer heat shimmered off asphalt roads and children played until the streetlights came on. Sarah Mitchell lived on Cotton Street, a quiet road lined with pecan trees 3 blocks from First Baptist Church. And she was 9 years old with blonde hair that her mother braided every morning and bright blue eyes that sparkled when she sang hymns in church. She loved carrying her white leather Bible with her name embossed in gold letters, a gift from her parents that she treasured and took everywhere, especially to Sunday school, where she sat in the front row and raised her hand to answer every question Mrs. Pruitt asked. Every Sunday, Sarah attended services with her parents, David and Rebecca Mitchell, along with her younger brother Tommy, who was 6 years old and followed his sister everywhere, holding her hand as they walked through the church hallways decorated with colorful bulletin boards. On the morning of August 15th, the family drove to church as they always did, the parking lot full of cars and families filing into the building under the hot Texas sun, and Sarah wore a yellow sundress with white sandals while clutching her Bible against her chest. Rebecca kissed her forehead before Sunday school started, and David reminded both children to wait in the fellowship hall after service so he and Rebecca could pick them up at noon, and Sarah nodded obediently before taking Tommy's hand to walk down the hallway. Sunday school lasted an hour with Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt teaching lessons about Daniel in the lion's den, and Sarah sat in the front row raising her hand to answer questions and coloring pictures of lions with crayons, while Tommy sat with the younger children in the next room. At 11:45, Mrs. Pruitt dismissed the class and told the children to go to the fellowship hall where their parents would meet them, and Sarah gathered her things, including her Bible and coloring page, before walking out of the classroom with the other children. Tommy was already in the hallway with his group when Sarah stopped and told him she forgot something in the classroom, saying she would catch up in just a minute, and Tommy walked ahead with the other children toward the fellowship hall without looking back. Sarah turned back toward the classroom where Mrs. Pruitt was erasing the chalkboard, but instead of going inside, she slipped through the side door that led to the parking lot, to the field behind the church, to the old Henderson barn that sat on the property line. No one saw Sarah walk across the gravel lot in her yellow sundress. No one saw her disappear into the August heat, and no one realized she was missing until her parents arrived at the fellowship hall at noon to find Tommy waiting but Sarah nowhere in sight. Rebecca asked Tommy where his sister was, and Tommy said she went back for something and said she would catch up, but she never did. And David immediately began walking through the church calling Sarah's name while checking bathrooms, classrooms, and the sanctuary. Rebecca's voice grew louder and more desperate as other parents joined the search, looking in every room, every closet, every corner of the building, while Mrs. Pruitt explained that Sarah had left the classroom, but she did not know where the girl had gone. The side door was unlocked because it was always unlocked during services, and by 12:30 someone called the police, and by 1 o'clock the parking lot was filled with patrol cars as officers asked questions and took statements from everyone who had been at the church. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA archives where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. The search expanded quickly as volunteers from the congregation spread out across the church grounds, walking through the field and checking the Henderson barn, which was an old structure with rotting wood and a rusted tin roof that had been abandoned for years. A few men walked inside the barn calling Sarah's name, their voices echoing in the empty space as they looked past hay bales stacked in the corner and farm tools hanging on the walls. But they saw nothing out of place and moved on to search other areas. The search continued through the afternoon and into the evening with flashlights sweeping through the darkness, and dogs were brought in to track Sarah's scent, which they picked up near the side door of the church before losing it in the parking lot near the gravel in the field. Detective James Lawson took lead on the case, a 51-year-old lifelong resident of Waxahachie who knew the Mitchell family and knew the church, and he interviewed everyone, including Mrs. Pruitt, other teachers, parents who had been there, and children who had seen Sarah. No one had useful information because Sarah had simply walked away and no one had noticed until it was too late, and the town mobilized to print flyers with Sarah's school photo that appeared on every telephone pole while her face was shown on the news every night. Rebecca and David appeared on camera with Rebecca's hands shaking as she begged whoever had taken Sarah to bring her home, saying Sarah needed her medicine because she had asthma, while David sat silent beside her with a pale, hollow face after searching until his voice gave out. The days turned into weeks as tips came in, including a report of a girl matching Sarah's description seen in Dallas, which turned out not to be her, and someone reported a man acting suspicious near the church, but he had an alibi that checked out. By September, the case began to cool, not because people stopped caring, but because there were no leads, no evidence, and no witnesses to what had happened. And Sarah's white Bible was never found, even though Rebecca had given it to her for her 8th birthday, and Sarah never went anywhere without it. The investigation continued, but slowly and quietly, with Detective Lawson keeping the file on his desk and reading through it every week looking for something he had missed. But there was nothing except the haunting fact that Sarah Mitchell had disappeared from a church on a Sunday morning. Years passed and the Mitchells stayed in Waxahachie because they could not leave, feeling that leaving would be like abandoning Sarah wherever she was. And Rebecca kept Sarah's room exactly as it had been, with the bed made, stuffed animals on the shelf, and the yellow sundress hanging in the closet. David stopped going to church because he could not walk through those doors again, could not sit in those pews or look at that side door. And Tommy grew up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, remembering her hand holding his, and her voice telling him she would catch up. Tommy carried guilt with him, feeling that he should have waited or gone back with her or done something to prevent what happened. And he graduated high school in 2004 before studying criminal justice in college because he wanted to find answers for other families. Detective Lawson retired in 2007 after working Sarah's case for 14 years, following every lead and interviewing hundreds of people, searching that barn a dozen times, and walking those fields until he knew every inch but never finding her. He handed the case file to a younger detective named Maria Vasquez, who was 32, sharp and determined, and she read through the file twice, noticing the gaps and questions that had never been answered, including places that had been searched, but maybe not thoroughly enough. She wanted to revisit the Henderson barn, which had been mentioned in the original reports, but only briefly, with a few men having walked through, found nothing, and moved on. And by 2015, Sarah's case was 22 years old. The church had been renovated with the parking lot repaved and the field turned into a community garden, but the Henderson barn still stood leaning and decaying, with the town having tried to tear it down twice, but the property owner kept delaying the demolition. Detective Vasquez drove out there on a Tuesday morning and walked through the tall grass to find the barn door hanging open now, completely off one hinge. And inside, the air was thick with dust while sunlight streamed through gaps in the tin roof. She walked slowly and carefully, looking at everything, including the walls, the floor, and the corners, and she climbed into the loft where old farm equipment rusted in silence, and then she saw it tucked between two beams in the far corner beneath years of dust and debris. She pulled on gloves and reached for it carefully, discovering it was a book with a leather cover that was stained and warped from moisture but still intact, and when she turned it over, she saw gold lettering that was faded but readable with the name Sarah Mitchell embossed on the cover. Vasquez stopped breathing as she held the Bible in her hands, realizing this was Sarah's Bible, the one she had been carrying the day she disappeared, and it had been here all along in this barn for 22 years, overlooked, forgotten, and hidden in plain sight. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive, because new investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Vasquez carefully placed the Bible in an evidence bag and drove straight to the Ellis County Sheriff's Office, where she requested immediate DNA testing, and the Bible was sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin, where they handled it with extreme care. The Bible was fragile with pages that stuck together, but there was biological material including skin cells, oils from fingers, and possibly saliva, and the lab extracted what they could to build a profile, even though it took 4 months because the Bible was old and the samples were degraded. Sarah's DNA was the primary profile, with her fingerprints on every page and her saliva on the corners where she had licked her fingers to turn pages. But there was another profile that was male and unknown, found on the cover and on several interior pages, as if someone else had handled the Bible repeatedly. Vasquez ran the profile through CODIS, not expecting a match because most cold cases did not get that lucky. But she tried anyway, and 3 weeks later the system returned a result showing a partial match that was strong enough to investigate. The profile belonged to a man named Robert Dale Henderson, who was 68 years old and lived in Waxahachie, having been arrested in 2013 for assault, which resulted in his DNA being entered into the database, and Vasquez pulled his file with shaking hands. Robert Henderson, and the barn was on Henderson property, his family having owned that land for generations, and he had been interviewed in 1993 briefly, when he said he had not seen anything because he had been at home that Sunday with his wife confirming his alibi. He was never considered a suspect, just a neighbor and property owner who happened to live near the church. But now 22 years later, his DNA was on Sarah's Bible, and Detective Vasquez sat in her office with the file spread across her desk, staring at Henderson's photograph from 1993. A man in his 40s with thinning hair, average height, and unremarkable features who worked as a mechanic and owned the land behind the church where he had lived his whole life. And during the original investigation, Detective Lawson had spoken with him for only 15 minutes. Henderson said he was home that Sunday and had not attended church because he rarely did. And his wife, Linda Henderson, confirmed they had been home together working in the garden, saying they had not seen or heard anything unusual that day. The interview was cooperative and calm, with Henderson expressing sympathy for the Mitchell family and offering to let officers search his property any time, and they had searched by walking through the fields and looking in the barn, but it was cursory and quick. Now his DNA was on a missing child's Bible found in his barn, and Vasquez called the crime lab to ask if there was any possibility of contamination or if the DNA could have been transferred accidentally, but the analyst was certain it had been on the Bible for decades. Vasquez began building a case by pulling Henderson's employment records from 1993, which showed he worked at a garage on Main Street and was off on Sundays, and she checked his criminal history, finding the assault charge from 2013 was his first offense. She looked into his family and discovered Linda Henderson had died in 2009 from cancer. They had no children, and Robert lived alone now in the same house on the same property, with the barn still visible from the road, still standing and still rotting. Vasquez needed more before bringing him in. She needed to understand why Sarah's Bible was in his barn, and she returned to the original case file to read every interview, every statement, and every tip that had come in looking for Henderson's name, which appeared only once. But she found something else in a witness statement from a woman named Carol Preston, who had been at the church that Sunday, and mentioned seeing a truck near the barn, an old pickup that was faded blue and parked oddly facing the field. Vasquez cross-referenced vehicle registrations from 1993 and found that Robert Henderson owned a 1987 Chevrolet pickup that was faded blue, and the pieces were coming together with Henderson's truck near the barn, Sarah's Bible in the barn, and Henderson's DNA on the Bible. Vasquez contacted Detective Lawson, who was retired but answered immediately, and when she told him what she had found, there was silence on the line before Lawson spoke, saying he remembered Henderson seeming genuinely concerned and helpful, even offering his property for searches. Vasquez asked if Lawson had ever suspected him, and he said no, because Henderson had an alibi. His wife vouched for him, and there was no reason to look closer. But Vasquez knew that alibis could be lies and wives could cover for husbands. She obtained a warrant to search Henderson's current residence and assembled a team that arrived at dawn on a Thursday in November 2015. And Henderson answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, looking older now with gray hair and a weathered face. Vasquez showed him the warrant, saying they needed to search the property, and Henderson did not resist, stepping aside and asking if he needed a lawyer, to which Vasquez said that was his right. But Henderson said he had nothing to hide, and they could search anywhere they wanted. The team moved through the house, checking the bedroom, kitchen, and garage, where they found tools, old furniture, and boxes of paperwork, but nothing unusual. And then, they searched the barn again more thoroughly, this time by removing every hay bale and every piece of equipment. In the corner where the Bible had been found, they discovered something else beneath rotted floorboards. A small space that had been used as a hiding place, and inside was a yellow sundress that was child-sized, stained, and faded, but unmistakable. Detective Vasquez stared at the dress, recognizing it from the photographs, from the missing person reports, and from Rebecca Mitchell's tearful descriptions. A yellow sundress with small white flowers that Sarah had been wearing the day she disappeared from church. Vasquez called the forensic team to photograph everything, including the hiding place, the dress, and the exact location before bagging it carefully. while Henderson remained inside the house with an officer standing guard, and Vasquez walked back across the property to confront him. Henderson sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and his face blank, and he looked up when Vasquez entered, asking if they had found what they were looking for. But Vasquez sat down across from him without answering, just watching and studying his face. She asked Henderson if he wanted to tell her what happened, and Henderson was quiet, looking down at his hands and saying he did not know what she meant. But Vasquez told him they had found the Bible, the dress, and his DNA, saying it was over, and he could tell the truth now. Henderson closed his eyes and sat very still, not speaking for a long time while the kitchen clock ticked on the wall and the refrigerator hummed, and then he opened his eyes saying he had been waiting for this day, knowing eventually someone would look harder. He said he would tell her everything but wanted it recorded and official because he did not want to repeat it, saying he could only say it once, and Vasquez read him his rights while Henderson said he understood and did not want a lawyer. He just wanted to confess. They drove to the Ellis County Sheriff's Office with Henderson sitting in the back of the patrol car staring out the window without speaking, and at the station they placed him in an interrogation room where Vasquez set up recording equipment and pressed record. Henderson stated his name as Robert Dale Henderson and began to talk, saying he had been working in the barn that Sunday morning on August 15, 1993, fixing a tractor because he did not go to church like he never did, and he heard footsteps outside. He looked through the barn door and saw a little girl walking across the field alone carrying a white Bible, and he recognized her as Sarah Mitchell from the family that lived down the road, having seen her before at church events and around town where she was always smiling and polite. He said he did not know why he did what he did next, but he called to her and asked if she was lost, and Sarah stopped to look at him, while he said he would walk her back to church because she should not be alone, and Sarah hesitated, but Henderson seemed kind. Sarah walked into the barn thinking he would take her through a shortcut, but there was no shortcut. There was only the barn and him, and when Sarah realized something was wrong and tried to leave, Henderson blocked the door while she started crying and clutching her Bible. Henderson said he panicked because he did not want her to scream or anyone to hear, so he grabbed her and covered her mouth while she struggled and dropped the Bible. And he said it happened quickly. He did not mean to hurt her, but she stopped moving. He sat there holding her small body, not knowing what to do, and he heard voices in the distance as the search had started with people calling Sarah's name, so he had to hide her and think quickly about what to do next. He took off her dress without knowing why, just doing it, and he wrapped her in a tarp before burying her beneath the barn floor in a space he had dug years before for storage, and he hid the dress and kept the Bible, telling himself he would throw them away, but he never did. Vasquez asked where Sarah was now, and Henderson said she was still there beneath the barn where he had put her 22 years ago, and Vasquez stood up and walked out to call the forensic team, telling them to bring ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. She called Rebecca Mitchell and told her they had found someone. They were searching the barn and she should prepare herself, but Rebecca did not speak. Vasquez only heard her breathing and then crying before the line went dead. The excavation team arrived at the Henderson property at dawn with cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic anthropologists, while the barn was cordoned off with yellow tape and news vans lined the road with reporters standing behind barriers and cameras pointed at the old structure. The dogs alerted immediately beneath the northwest corner where the floorboards had been removed and where the yellow dress had been hidden, and the team began to dig slowly and carefully, removing layers of earth and sifting through dirt and debris. 3 feet down they found fabric that was decomposed and nearly disintegrated, the remnants of a tarp, and beneath it were bones that were small and fragile, a child's skeleton that was transported to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office for forensic examination. The examination confirmed what everyone already knew, that the bones belonged to a child approximately 9 years old and female, and the dental records matched. It was Sarah Mitchell who had been there all along, less than half a mile from her home. She had been buried beneath a barn while her family searched, while her face appeared on flyers, while her mother kept her room untouched, and she had been there alone, forgotten by everyone except the man who put her there 22 years ago. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So, if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth because a new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Detective Vasquez called the Mitchells and asked if they could come to the station, and Rebecca and David drove in silence while Tommy met them there. and they sat in a conference room with Vasquez sitting across from them to tell them what they had found. She told them Sarah was coming home, and Rebecca covered her mouth, making no sound while David stared at the wall, and Tommy asked if she had suffered, and Vasquez said the investigation was ongoing, but based on Henderson's confession, she believed it had been quick. Tommy nodded without asking anything else, just sitting there staring at his hands, and the funeral was held 4 weeks later in December 2015, 22 years after Sarah disappeared, at First Baptist Church, where she had attended Sunday school. The sanctuary was full of family, friends, people who had searched, people who had never stopped hoping, and people who had carried Sarah's story for decades, and the casket was white and small, covered in yellow roses because yellow was Sarah's favorite color. Pastor Coleman spoke about faith, loss, and the mystery of why God allows suffering, but Rebecca did not hear most of it as she sat in the front pew holding David's hand, thinking about the last time she had seen Sarah and all the birthdays she never had. After the service, they drove to Waxahachie Cemetery, where the grave was beneath a large oak tree with a simple headstone that read, Sarah Grace Mitchell, beloved daughter and sister, 1984 to 1993, and Rebecca placed Sarah's white Bible on the grave. David stood beside her and had not cried at the service but cried now, while Tommy stayed back watching his parents and thinking about all the years they had carried this weight, all the years they had hoped, and all the years they had not known the truth. He thought about the man sitting in a cell, the man who had taken his sister, the man whose DNA on a child's Bible had finally revealed the truth after 22 years of silence. And Robert Dale Henderson was charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. His public defender advised him to plead not guilty and fight the charges, but Henderson refused, saying he had already confessed and did not want the Mitchells to endure a trial, saying he owed them that much. And in February 2016, he entered a guilty plea. The courtroom was packed with Rebecca and David sitting in the front row and Tommy beside them, while Henderson stood before the judge and looked at the Mitchells for the first time, looking directly at them while Rebecca stared back without blinking or looking away. The judge asked if Henderson understood the charges, and he said he did, then asked if he was pleading guilty of his own free will, and he said he was, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole before Henderson was led away in handcuffs. Rebecca exhaled because she had been holding her breath waiting for this moment, for justice and closure, but it did not feel like she thought it would because it did not bring Sarah back, did not erase 22 years of not knowing, and did not heal the wound. David helped Rebecca stand and they walked out of the courtroom together, while reporters waited outside with cameras flashing and questions being shouted. But they did not stop or answer. They just walked to their car and drove home in silence. The days after the sentencing felt strange and hollow, because for 22 years the Mitchells had lived with a question that had no answer. And now the question was answered, but the answer did not bring the relief they had imagined, only a different kind of pain. Emily was not coming home. She had never been coming home, and she had been gone since the moment she walked into Robert Henderson's barn on that August morning in 1993. And that finality was harder to bear than the years of not knowing. Rebecca returned to the cemetery often, bringing flowers and sitting on the grass beside the headstone, talking to Sarah the way she used to when Sarah was small, telling her about the weather, about Tommy and his work, about the neighbor's cat that liked to sleep on their porch. She talked until her voice gave out, and then she sat in silence, and David threw himself into projects around the house, finishing the ones he had started years ago, building shelves and repainting rooms and fixing broken fences until his hands ached, and he was too tired to think. Tommy continued his work in cold cases after requesting a transfer to the Ellis County Sheriff's Department because he wanted to be close to home, close to his parents, and he worked with Detective Vasquez on other unsolved cases, learning from her approach and dedication. He saw the way she treated each file with careful attention, the same way she had treated Sarah's case, and he wanted to be that kind of detective, the kind who did not give up, the kind who believed that answers still existed even in the darkest corners. The town of Waxahachie processed the news in its own way, with some people feeling closure while others felt anger, asking how Henderson had gone unnoticed for so long and how he had been cleared in the original investigation with such a simple alibi that his wife had provided. Detective Lawson, now in his 70s, read about the arrest in the newspaper and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, thinking about the interview he had conducted in 1993. thinking about the questions he had asked and the ones he had not asked. He thought about how he had accepted Henderson's alibi without pushing harder, without questioning the wife separately, without searching the barn more thoroughly, and he called Detective Vasquez to tell her he was sorry, but Vasquez said there was nothing to apologize for. She said DNA technology in 1993 was not what it was now, and Lawson had done everything he could with the tools he had, but Lawson did not feel absolved because he felt the weight of those 22 years and the face of a 9-year-old girl he had failed to bring home. The Bible became a focal point in the media coverage, with reporters wanting to know how Henderson's DNA had ended up on it, and the theory that emerged was both simple and chilling, that Henderson had likely taken the Bible from Sarah after she dropped it in the barn. He had held it, touched it, perhaps even read it in the days and weeks after her death, and his DNA had transferred to the leather cover and the pages, remaining there for 22 years until technology advanced enough to extract and identify it. Forensic experts explained it was touch DNA, the kind of genetic material left behind by skin cells that is invisible to the naked eye but present and persistent, surviving decades in storage and waiting for someone to look, to test, to believe that answers still existed. The case became a teaching tool in police academies across Texas, used in training to teach cadets about the importance of preserving evidence, about advancements in DNA technology, about the value of cold case units, and about never assuming a case was truly closed. Detective Vasquez was invited to speak at conferences where she told Sarah's story and talked about persistence, about the importance of revisiting old evidence with new technology, about believing that every piece of evidence has the potential to speak if someone is willing to listen. She showed photographs of the Bible, the yellow sundress, the barn where Sarah had been hidden for over 2 decades, and she emphasized that cold cases were not just files in storage. They were families still waiting, still hoping, still deserving of answers. Rebecca Mitchell never spoke publicly about the case, declining all interview requests because she did not want to be on television or relive the worst day of her life over and over for an audience. But she wrote a letter to Detective Vasquez thanking her. In the letter, she said that for 22 years she had lived in a kind of limbo, not knowing if Sarah was alive or dead, not knowing if someone had taken her or if she had gotten lost, and the not knowing had been unbearable, worse than any truth could be. But now she knew, and as painful as the truth was, it was better than the silence and better than the questions. And she said Sarah could finally rest in peace, and so could she. And David died 3 years later from a heart attack that the doctor said was sudden. But Tommy knew better because his father had been dying slowly for 22 years, the weight of grief wearing him down piece by piece until there was nothing left. And Janet lived alone after that, with Marcus visiting often to bring groceries and fix things around the house. They did not always talk. Sometimes they just sat together in the living room in silence, in the shared understanding of what they had lost and what they had survived. And Robert Henderson remained in prison, without appealing his sentence or requesting parole hearings. He worked in the prison library and kept to himself, and other inmates knew what he had done. They knew about Sarah, and some of them had children or had lost children, but Henderson was not attacked. He simply existed in a kind of isolation. He was a man who had destroyed a family, a man who had carried a secret for 22 years, a man who had finally been caught by the very thing he had touched and kept, a child's Bible that had refused to stay silent. The years moved forward and the case faded from headlines as new stories replaced it, new tragedies and new mysteries. But in Waxahachie, Sarah Grace Mitchell was not forgotten, and First Baptist Church planted a magnolia tree in her memory with a small plaque at the base. The plaque read, "In loving memory of Sarah Grace Mitchell, forever 9. And children passed it every Sunday on their way to services, most not knowing the full story, but their parents and grandparents did. And every August on the anniversary of her disappearance, the church held a moment of silence. It was a reminder that some losses never fully heal, that some children never get to grow up, and that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces." And Tommy Carter became a full detective in 2020, wearing his badge the way his father had worn his grief, quietly and heavily. He worked cold cases exclusively, requesting files that had gone untouched for decades, reading through witness statements and looking at evidence logs, searching for the overlooked fragments that everyone else had missed, the small pieces that could change everything. He thought about Sarah every time he opened a new file, thought about the Bible that had waited 22 years to speak, thought about how something so small and seemingly insignificant had held the answer for so long, and he learned to look at evidence differently, not just as objects in boxes, but as voices waiting to be heard, waiting for the right person to listen and the right technology to unlock their secrets. And Detective Vasquez retired in 2023 after 30 years with the Ellis County Sheriff's Department. She had solved 56 cold cases during her career, bringing closure to families who had waited years and sometimes decades for answers. But Sarah's case was the one she thought about most, because it was the one that had taught her the most about patience and persistence. On her last day, she stopped by the evidence room and asked to see Sarah's Bible one more time, and the clerk brought it out in its sealed evidence bag, and Vasquez held it carefully through the plastic, thinking about the journey it had taken from a child's hands to a barn to a lab. She thought about the faith required to believe that answers would come, the patience to wait for science to catch up, and the determination to never let a case go truly cold. And she closed her eyes for a moment before handing it back and walking out of the building. Rebecca Mitchell continued her visits to the cemetery once a week, sometimes more, bringing fresh flowers and clearing away the old ones, keeping the grave neat and clean. And she talked to Sarah about everything that was happening in her life and in the world. She told Sarah about Tommy and his wife and their daughter, Sarah's niece who would never meet her aunt but who would grow up hearing stories about her, about the girl with blonde braids who loved to sing hymns and carried a white Bible everywhere she went. Rebecca made sure of that, made sure Sarah was more than a tragedy or a headline. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, someone who had been loved and was still loved, and the science that solved Sarah's case continued to evolve with new methods being developed constantly. Touch DNA became more refined and more reliable. Labs developed techniques to extract genetic material from smaller and smaller samples, from older and older evidence, and cold cases across the country were being reopened as a result. Evidence boxes pulled from storage and re-examined. Letters, clothing, personal items, objects that had been sitting untouched for decades were now being tested with advanced technology, and one by one answers began to emerge. Faces given to crimes, names attached to mysteries, families receiving phone calls they had stopped hoping for. It was not always closure in the way people imagined, but it was always truth. And in 2025, a documentary crew contacted Rebecca Mitchell wanting to tell Sarah's story, saying it was an important case that demonstrated the power of forensic science and the importance of never giving up. Rebecca said no at first because she did not want cameras in her home or to sit in front of lights and microphones, but Tommy convinced her, saying Sarah's story could help other families and other investigators, saying it could keep cold cases from being forgotten and encourage persistence. Rebecca agreed, but only on her terms. She would not appear on camera and would not give interviews. But she allowed the crew to use photographs and police records and to tell the story in a way that honored Sarah, not as a victim, but as a child who had lived and mattered. The documentary aired in 2026 and was called The Bible, detailing the case from beginning to end, the disappearance, the search, the years of silence, the discovery of the Bible, the DNA match, the arrest, the confession, and the recovery of Sarah's remains. It featured interviews with Detective Vasquez, with forensic analysts, with experts in cold case investigation, and it showed the white leather Bible with Sarah's name embossed in gold, showed how a single piece of evidence had waited and endured, and finally spoken after more than 2 decades. The documentary won awards and was screened at film festivals and used in criminal justice courses, becoming a reference point and case study, a reminder that evidence never truly goes silent. It simply waits for someone to listen and for science to catch up to the truth. Robert Henderson watched the documentary from prison where inmates gathered in the common room, with the television mounted on the wall. And when Sarah's face appeared on the screen, the room went quiet, and Henderson sat in the back, not moving and not looking away. He watched the entire thing without expression, and when it ended, he stood up and walked back to his cell where he lay down on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the Bible, about the morning he had called to Sarah, about the choice he had made that defined the rest of his life. He thought about the DNA, about how something invisible had carried the truth for 22 years, how it had waited patiently in the fibers of leather and paper until technology could read its story, how it had found him when he thought he was safe. He closed his eyes but did not sleep, and the story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. So if stories like this move you and you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA, subscribe to the DNA Archives. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. Because new stories of truth and closure are released every single day, and the truth always waits for those willing to seek it. The impact of Sarah's case extended beyond Waxahachie, as police departments across Texas began re-examining their own cold case files. Evidence rooms were audited, boxes were cataloged, and items that had been deemed irrelevant in the 1980s and 90s were sent for DNA testing. Letters, cigarette butts, drinking glasses, pieces of fabric, personal items that had sat untouched for decades were now being processed with advanced technology. And with each new test, new leads emerged. Some cases were solved within months while others took years. But the process had begun. The silence was breaking across the state and beyond as other jurisdictions took notice of what had happened in Waxahachie. How a Bible found in a barn had solved a 22-year-old mystery. How persistence and technology had combined to bring truth to light. In Houston, a case from 1989 was reopened involving a young woman who had been found in a park, with no identification and no witnesses, and for 36 years, she remained a Jane Doe. But investigators had kept her clothing and jewelry in storage. DNA was extracted and a profile was built, then entered into genealogical databases, and within weeks a family connection was found. The woman was identified as Maria Santos, who had been reported missing by her family in San Antonio, and they had searched for her, never stopping their hope. And now decades later they finally knew what had happened, and Sarah's case had shown them it was possible, that answers could still come even after all that time, that evidence could speak if someone took the time to listen and use the right tools. Detective Tommy Carter worked a case in 2027 involving a disappearance from 2003, a teenage girl who had vanished on her way home from school, and the case had gone cold within 18 months with no leads and no suspects. Tommy requested the evidence and found a backpack the girl had been carrying, recovered near a drainage ditch 4 days after the disappearance, and DNA testing revealed an unknown male profile on the shoulder straps, transferred there from someone who had grabbed or carried the backpack. Tommy ran it through CODIS with no match, then ran it through genealogical databases, finding a distant relative and then another, and he built a family tree methodically, narrowing the possibilities over 6 months until he had a name, and an arrest was made. The girl's family finally had answers after 24 years of not knowing, and Tommy thought about his sister Sarah, thought about how long his family had waited, and he was grateful this family did not have to wait as long as his had. Rebecca Mitchell received letters from other families, not many but enough, letters from other mothers who had lost children, other parents who had waited decades for answers, and they thanked her, saying Sarah's story had given them hope, had shown them cold cases could still be solved. They said it proved that evidence could still speak, and that justice could still come even after many years had passed. And Rebecca read every letter and kept them in a box beside her bed, not responding to most of them because she did not know what to say. But she understood why they wrote, understood the need to reach out and connect with someone who had walked the same dark road. And she kept the letters because they mattered, because Sarah's story had mattered not just to her family, but to families she would never meet. David's grave was next to Sarah's at Waxahachie Cemetery, and Rebecca visited them together, bringing flowers for both and sitting between the two headstones, talking to them about Tommy and his cases, about his successes and his dedication to helping other families find answers. She told Sarah about her niece, about how she was learning to play piano, about how she had her aunt's blonde hair and blue eyes, and Rebecca wondered sometimes what Sarah would have become, what she would have studied, who she would have married, what kind of mother she would have been. But those were questions without answers, dreams that had died in a barn behind a church on an August morning in 1993, and all she had now were memories and the knowledge that the man who had taken those dreams was behind bars forever. The White Bible remained in the evidence room at the Ellis County Sheriff's Office, permanently archived as a piece of history and a teaching tool, and students and investigators visited to see it, standing in front of the glass case and looking at the worn leather cover. They saw Sarah's name in faded gold letters, learned about touch DNA and how genetic material could transfer from skin to surface, about how evidence could wait and endure and speak decades later, when the right technology became available to unlock its secrets. The Bible had become more than evidence. It had become a symbol and a reminder that justice did not have an expiration date, that science could uncover what time had tried to bury, that truth was patient and persistent and would wait as long as necessary. Detective Vasquez spent her retirement writing about her cases, not for publication but for herself, because she wanted to remember and preserve the details, the faces, the families, the moments when truth finally emerged from darkness and brought some measure of peace. She wrote about Sarah, about the day she climbed into that barn loft and saw the white object tucked between beams, about the moment she realized what she was holding, about the feeling of knowing this small book could change everything for a family that had suffered so long. She wrote about calling Rebecca Mitchell with the news, about the sound of her voice when she learned they had found him, about the tears and the silence and the weight of 22 years lifting just slightly. And Vasquez wrote until her hands cramped and the memories were on paper, where they could not fade, where they would not be forgotten, where future investigators could read them and understand that persistence mattered, that believing in evidence mattered, that families deserved answers no matter how much time had passed. In 2028, the forensic analyst who had processed Sarah's Bible gave a lecture at Sam Houston State University, talking about the evolution of DNA analysis over her 35-year career, about the cases that had shaped her understanding of what was possible with science and determination. She showed slides with photographs of evidence, charts of genetic markers, timelines of technological advancement, and then she showed the white leather Bible, showed Sarah's name in gold, showed the interior pages where DNA had been extracted from oils and skin cells. She told the story of the disappearance, the decades of silence, the decision to retest old evidence with new methods, the match that led to Henderson, the confession, the recovery, and she said it was the most important case she had ever worked. Not because it was the most complex or the most challenging, but because it had mattered, because a family had finally gotten answers, because a child had finally come home, because justice had finally been served after more than 2 decades of waiting. The town of Waxahachie changed in small ways over the years, not visibly in ways a visitor would notice, but the people who had lived through Sarah's disappearance carried it differently now. There was a before and an after, a line that divided their understanding of the world. Before, there had been uncertainty and fear that whoever had taken Sarah was still out there, still among them, still walking the same streets and shopping at the same stores, still living an ordinary life while a family suffered, and that fear had been suffocating. After the arrest, that fear dissolved, but it left something behind. A quiet acknowledgement that evil did not always announce itself, that it could wear the most unremarkable face, that it could be a neighbor who offered to help search, who expressed sympathy, who lived 2 properties away. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter after Sarah's case was solved. They watched a little closer, not out of paranoia but out of awareness, the kind that comes from experience and loss, the kind that understands danger can hide in plain sight. The Henderson barn was finally torn down in 2029 after the property was sold to a developer, and on the day the demolition crew arrived, Rebecca Mitchell drove out to watch, parking her car on the side of the road and sitting in silence as the old structure came down. She watched the walls collapse, watched the tin roof cave in, watched the wood splinter and the dust rise, and when it was over and nothing remained but a pile of rubble, she felt something release inside her chest, a weight she had been carrying without realizing it. That barn had held her daughter for 22 years, had kept Sarah's body hidden while the world searched, and now it was gone, reduced to broken boards and twisted metal, and Rebecca drove home feeling lighter than she had in decades. Tommy Carter's daughter turned 9 in 2030, the same age Sarah had been when she disappeared, and the family gathered for a small birthday party at Rebecca's house with cake and presents and laughter that filled the rooms. Young Sarah, named after her aunt, blew out the candles and made a wish, and Rebecca watched her granddaughter with tears in her eyes, thinking about the other Sarah who never got to turn 10, who never got to grow up, who never got to have children of her own. But she was grateful for this Sarah, grateful that the name continued, that the memory lived on in a child who was bright and kind and full of life. And after the party, when everyone had gone home, Rebecca took her granddaughter to the cemetery. They stood together at the grave, and young Sarah placed a bouquet of yellow flowers on the headstone, and Rebecca told her about the aunt she was named after, about the girl who loved to sing hymns and carried a white Bible, about the tragedy that had shaped their family. Young Sarah listened quietly, and when Rebecca finished, she asked if her aunt was happy now, and Rebecca said yes. She believed Sarah was at peace, that she was no longer lost or alone, that she was home with her father in a place where there was no more pain. Robert Henderson's health continued to decline in prison as diabetes and heart disease took their toll, and he was moved to the medical unit where he spent his days in a small room with white walls and a narrow bed, receiving no visitors because he had no one left. His ex-wife had not contacted him since his arrest. He had no children or siblings or friends, and he existed in complete isolation, alone in the way he had left Sarah alone in that barn. And he thought about the symmetry of it sometimes, about how his punishment was not just imprisonment but emptiness. The knowledge that no one cared whether he lived or died, that he had erased himself from the world the same way he had tried to erase what he had done, but the world had moved on without him, while Sarah was remembered and honored and loved. Rebecca Mitchell turned 75 in 2032, and Tommy organized a small family gathering to celebrate. But later that evening, when she was alone in her room, she thought about all the birthdays Sarah never had, all the milestones that were stolen, 8, 9, 10, all the way to what would have been 49 years old. And Rebecca had imagined those birthdays over the years, had pictured Sarah blowing out candles and opening presents and growing older. But those were fantasies, beautiful and painful and impossible. The only birthday that truly mattered was the one Sarah had, 9 years old, the last one before everything ended. And Rebecca allowed herself to cry that night, not with the desperate grief of the early years, but with a quieter sadness, the kind that comes with acceptance. The white Bible in its glass case continued to draw visitors, fewer as the years passed, but they still came, reading the small placard that explained its significance, looking at the worn leather and faded gold letters, understanding that this object had changed everything for a family. They learned about the technology that made it possible, about the dedication of investigators who refused to give up, about the importance of preserving evidence no matter how insignificant it might seem, because you never knew when science would advance enough to read its secrets. In 2035, a new generation of forensic scientists entered the field, young people who had grown up with DNA analysis as a standard tool, who learned about CODIS and genealogical databases and touch DNA as fundamental parts of their education. They studied cases like Sarah's, analyzed the methods used, discussed what could be improved and refined, and they carried forward the work that had begun decades earlier, the work of giving voice to the silent, of uncovering what had been hidden, of bringing answers to families who had waited too long. Tommy Carter was promoted to lieutenant in 2036, now supervising a larger team of detectives specializing in cold cases, and he trained them the way Detective Vasquez had trained him, teaching them about patience and thoroughness and the importance of believing that answers existed. He told them about his sister, not often but when it mattered, when a case felt impossible or when evidence seemed too old or degraded to yield anything useful. And he told them about the white Bible that had sat in a barn for 22 years waiting to speak. He told them that evidence never stopped being evidence, that it only stopped mattering when people stopped looking, when people gave up. And he made sure his team understood that every file represented a family still waiting, still hoping, still deserving of truth. Rebecca Mitchell's health began to fail in 2037, with arthritis making it difficult to walk and high blood pressure requiring medication. And she moved more slowly now, visiting the cemetery less often, not because she wanted to, but because her body would not cooperate. Tommy drove her when he could, walking with her to the graves and standing beside her while she talked to Sarah and David, not interrupting, just waiting. And when she was ready, he helped her back to the car, knowing these visits mattered more than anything. They were not morbid or sad. They were connection and love. They were the only way his mother knew how to stay close to the people she had lost. And he honored that by being present, by being patient, by understanding that some wounds never fully heal. Rebecca Mitchell died peacefully in her sleep in 2039 at the age of 77, and Tommy found her in the morning looking calm and rested, as if she had finally let go of the weight she had carried for 46 years. He called the ambulance even though he knew it was too late, and he sat with her until they arrived, holding her hand and thinking about all the years she had waited for answers, all the days she had visited the cemetery, all the hope she had held on to, and then finally released. He thought about how tired she must have been, how ready to rest, and he kissed her forehead and told her she could go now, that Sarah was waiting, that David was waiting, that she did not have to carry the pain anymore. The funeral was small, with family and a few close friends gathering at First Baptist Church, where Sarah's service had been held decades before, and the same sanctuary where Rebecca had prayed every Sunday for her daughter's return now held her own memorial service. Pastor Coleman, now retired but still connected to the church, spoke about faith and perseverance, about a mother's love that never wavered even in the darkest times, about the strength it takes to survive unimaginable loss and still find reasons to keep living. Tommy sat in the front pew with his wife and daughter, young Sarah, now 17 years old and understanding fully the weight of the name she carried, and she cried quietly for the grandmother who had told her stories and taught her about resilience and shown her what it meant to love someone forever. Rebecca was buried beside David and Sarah at Waxahachie Cemetery, 3 headstones in a row under the oak tree, and Tommy stood at the graves after everyone else had left, looking at the names of his father, his sister, and now his mother. 3 people who had shaped every part of who he was, 3 losses that had defined his life and his career, 3 reasons he got up every morning and opened another cold case file, believing that other families deserved what his family had finally received after so many years. He thought about the White Bible, about Detective Vasquez's decision to search that barn one more time, about the DNA that had waited patiently in leather and paper, and he was grateful that his mother had lived to see justice, had lived to know the truth, had lived to bury Sarah properly. Robert Henderson died in prison 4 months later from heart failure at the age of 76, and there was no funeral, no service, no one to mourn him, and his body was cremated with the ashes going unclaimed for the required 60 days before being scattered in an unmarked location. He had wanted it that way, had written it in a brief will prepared by a prison legal aid service, saying he did not want anyone to know where he was buried, did not want anyone to visit, did not want to be remembered by anyone for anything. And so he was not. The world forgot Robert Dale Henderson completely, but it remembered Sarah Grace Mitchell, remembered her blonde braids and bright smile, remembered the White Bible that had finally spoken, remembered that truth had waited 22 years, but had come nonetheless. The case remained in textbooks and training manuals, cited in academic papers and referenced in lectures, used as an example of how forensic science had evolved, how cold cases could be solved decades later with persistence and advancing technology, how evidence never truly lost its voice. The White Bible stayed behind glass at the Ellis County Sheriff's Office as a permanent exhibit, and new officers were brought to see it during their training, learning the full story of Sarah Mitchell and understanding the lesson that patience and belief in evidence could change everything. Tommy Carter retired in 2049 after 30 years in law enforcement, having solved 83 cold cases and brought closure to families who had waited years and sometimes decades for answers. And on his last day, he stood in the evidence room one final time. He looked at the glass case containing his sister's Bible, at the worn white leather and the faded gold letters spelling out her name, and he thought about the 9-year-old girl who had carried it to church, who had loved to sing hymns, who had trusted a neighbor and paid with her life. He thought about his mother who had never given up hope, about his father who had been consumed by grief, about the 22 years they had all lived in darkness before light finally came. And he touched the glass gently, whispering thank you to the evidence that had finally spoken. He walked out of the building without looking back, going home to his family, to the life he had built on the foundation of loss and purpose. And he had learned that grief did not disappear, but transformed into something else, into determination, into the reason he opened files when others gave up. Years continued to pass, and Waxahachie grew with new neighborhoods built and new families moving in. And the story of Sarah Grace Mitchell became history, the kind that children learned about in school, distant enough to feel like it happened to someone else in another time. But those who had lived through it knew better, knew that history was made of moments and choices and small decisions that rippled outward, of children who went to Sunday school, of Bibles that held DNA, of detectives who refused to quit, of families who carried impossible weight. The magnolia tree planted in Sarah's memory grew tall and strong at First Baptist Church, its branches spreading wide and providing shade in the hot Texas summers. And every August, the church still held a moment of silence on the anniversary of her disappearance. It was a reminder that some children never get to grow up, that evil can hide in ordinary places, that justice sometimes takes decades but is worth pursuing, and that evidence has a voice if we are patient enough to listen and brave enough to seek the truth. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA, subscribe to the DNA Archives where it's free, and helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice. New stories of truth and closure are released every single day because the work continues, because families still wait, because evidence still speaks, and because some voices refuse to be silenced no matter how many years pass or how deeply they are buried. Sarah Grace Mitchell was 9 years old when she disappeared from Sunday school. She loved singing hymns and carried a white Bible everywhere. She had blonde braids and bright blue eyes and dreams of growing up, and though that future was stolen, her story endured. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to persistence, to science, to the refusal to let silence be the final word. And in the end, the truth came as it always does, patient and persistent, waiting in the pages of a child's Bible for someone to listen, for someone to believe, for someone to bring her home.